Left-hand rule! Arrange force! Go! Now what will you do, Jack Ripper? Death approaches! Who knows where I'll come from? I have won this!
I don't think there's a worse feeling in gaming than when you jump into a game, fully expecting to like it based on preview materials, and then gradually discover that the game didn't live up to expectations. That's what happened when I played Sub to Zombie, and it's something I've always felt with Tiny and Big. Tiny and Big, Grandpa's Leftovers, is a 2012 puzzle platformer developed by Black Pants Studios. It stars Tiny and his brother/rival Big. They're fighting over who has the right to their grandfather's family heirloom, a pair of ordinary-looking underpants. However, these underpants are anything but ordinary. Whoever possesses them seems to gain awesome power. Tiny doesn't think that his brother deserves any of that, and he goes off to the desert armed with his backpack full of gear and trusty radio to guide him. I played this game way back when it released, and it left me disappointed. I picked it up again a few days ago and ran through it twice. A blind run to de-rust, and a more concise run once I knew what to do and where to go. Unfortunately, my opinion on Tiny and Big hasn't changed, and in fact, it's been reaffirmed. This game looks and sounds great, but the gameplay needs some more polish in some respects, and it doesn't ever take full advantage of its mechanics. I definitely think that the art direction is the strongest aspect of Tiny and Big. It looks like a grungy indie comic in motion, down to presenting sound effects as onomatopoeia that superimpose themselves onto the field. The music has just as much character as the art direction, and the game incentivizes listening to its soundtrack by providing collectible cassette tapes that will add tracks to the playlist that cycles through the game as you progress. Every area has its own ambient track, but it's nice to pick up a collectible that provides a sensory reward instead of something intangible, like an achievement statistic. There are hidden secrets scattered about the levels, and you can find arcade cabinets that let you play challenges to test your skills with a laser. I like the look of these challenge levels the most, because the art direction goes for that Game Boy green color scheme, and all of the blocks look like the Game Boy version of Tetris pieces. That's actually what the training level looks like as well, as the conceit for the tutorial is that Tiny is playing on his not Game Boy, while on the road leading up to confronting his brother. Tiny is facing an uphill battle against Big, but he's got 3 gadgets to help him retrieve what's rightfully his. The claw is the first gadget. Tiny can latch onto any object that isn't fixed to the ground, and pull it as long as you're holding down the claw button. The laser is a second gadget. Tiny can make precision cuts on most objects by drawing a line that starts from the cursor and stretches out in any direction based on the movement of the mouse or right stick, depending on your control preferences. Any moving object will freeze in place once your laser comes into contact with it. The rocket is the third gadget. Although the first thing you learn is to push objects, the rocket allows you to push an object at a distance and with greater force depending on how long you hold down the rocket button. Besides the aforementioned ability to push objects and to jump, this is the entirety of Tiny's moveset. For the most part, Tiny is able to make his mark on the game world as he navigates through the desert, ascends a tower, and descends down the temple. Later levels introduce a certain material that the laser cannot cut, and navigating through these sections is more linear than the early game. I say more linear, but to be honest, even with all of the creative potential that the game offers with its gadgets, Tiny and Big is a very linear game. The game starts after the tutorial, when Tiny's taxi crashes into the desert after hitting something big. The starting area, the Bowl of Trying, is an open sandbox that allows the player to acclimate to the gadgets and how they affect the objects in the real world, as the tutorial only really teaches the player about how to control Tiny and the purpose of each gadget. The Bowl of Trying is a place for the player to experiment with the gadgets, to see their capabilities, limitations, and quirks. All 3 gadgets have a limit as to how far Tiny can be from their target. Making cuts with a laser requires a cutting line to bisect the target. That means you have to cut through an object instead of cutting into an object to make the cut happen. The rockets require a double tap kind of input. The first tap launches a rocket based on where the cursor was pointing at the time of the input. The second tap must be held down for the rocket to propel the target. It takes some practice to get a good feel for how long you need to hold down the button before your rocket pushes an object too far. Don't worry about making any permanent changes that can screw you over. You can press the O key or the back button to reset the area to the latest autosave, which the game does frequently. You'll know when the game autosaves because you'll see the radio on Tiny's backpack flash red, and this sound plays. Once you get out of the Bowl of Trying, Big ambushes Tiny and kicks him off a ledge and into the first chapter. Tiny falling into the next chapter is a recurring motif, and the game is cheeky enough to call itself out for over-relying on this plot device. Here's where I start dragging on the game. Tiny's goal is to ascend this ancient superstructure to face off against Big. Back when I first played this, and on my blind run, I took one look up at the shaft of this central area and tried to figure out how to ascend this structure. I made cuts on these pillars so that I could use them as ramps to climb up, but I always felt like I didn't have enough materials available to create a path. The thing is, I didn't need to be that creative. There's a doorway tucked in this far corner of the room that's easy to overlook and leads into the next area, and it's really obvious that this is how you're supposed to do things. There's a gap that's too far for Tiny to jump across, but there's a long block fixed to the ceiling conveniently hanging over that gap. Whatever shall I do? The ramps in these sections have gaps, but there are adjacent pillars that are tall enough to lean against the wall and serve as intermediary platforms. This part in the second chapter was kinda cool, where you're cutting through these monolithic slabs, and the way the camera is framed up results in you creating a ramp towards the top. On my second run, I tried to sequence break this area to see if I could skip over some spots, but the level design doesn't allow for that kind of lateral thinking. And that's really the game as a whole. You have these tools that can potentially alter the shape of the environment, but they're never used for their whole potential. You can't use a claw as a grapple to reach higher ground or swing across gaps. You can't embed a rocket on a block, and then stand on that block and ride it when you activate the rocket. It just zips out from under your feet. And although you do end up using your laser for defensive purposes, I'll air out my grievances over that mechanic later in the video. These tools have the potential to allow the player to become really experimental when it comes to navigation, but the game never requires a player to do so in the campaign, besides the hidden areas in the Bowl of Trying, which really challenged me to think about my approach to reaching those areas in a way that I never experienced again for the rest of the game. Besides the lack of any real experimentation with the platforming, another issue I have with the game's environments is that the physics of the game can be really random at times and cause different outcomes despite approaching obstacles the same way on repeated attempts. I've cut pillars to make bridges, but sometimes they bounce off whatever's underneath them in a way that causes them to fall into the pit. So now I gotta rewind. Again, the game frequently autosaves, but it's still annoying to reset your progress just because the physics didn't want to play ball that time. And even though objects in the game have physics, they don't really feel like they have mass. You ever see an object in a game bounce around in a way that looks uncanny because you know that real-life physics look much weightier? That's what it's like trying to move pillars in this game. If I push against a pillar, it's going to move straight in that direction, regardless of whether I justify Tiny to the left or right of center of the object. The claw allows for greater control in adjusting the angle of an object, but I'd have to pull the object, and that could put me dangerously close to a pitfall. So those are my issues with the game's navigation. Now let's talk about the combat set pieces. Oh yeah, there's combat in this game. Once you reach the 3rd chapter, Big starts actively antagonizing Tiny. The first real encounter with Big is quite the rude awakening. Grandpa's underpants allow Big to lift objects with his mind and hurl them at Tiny. This is where you learn to use the laser for defensive purposes. If you've ever played Metal Gear Rising, then you know about the Monsoon and Armstrong fights, where they throw large objects towards Raiden, and you have to use blade mode to cut through the objects before they crash into him. That's what you have to do against Big. He'll throw stuff at Tiny, and you need to cut through those objects with a laser. You know why blade mode set pieces work so well in MGR? Because the game does a lot of signposting to alert the player that the gameplay has temporarily shifted into a new mode. The screen flashes blue and everything slows down for a brief moment. There's a sound that plays that players learn to associate with blade mode. Once blade mode is activated, everything slows down to a crawl to give the player enough time to process what's happening and react accordingly. Once the player has cut through an object in blade mode, it loses all of its inertia and mass and drops down to the ground. This doesn't happen in Tiny and Big. When you activate your laser, everything is still moving at normal speed, including the object hurtling towards Tiny. There's a slight outline that overlays onto objects to show you that the laser will cut through them. That's what you have to look for when you see an object coming at Tiny. Once you activate the laser, the object comes to a dead stop until the laser finishes cutting through, and then it continues its trajectory because its inertia is preserved. That can screw you over if your cuts don't affect the parts of the object that will come into contact with Tiny. It's actually safer and more consistent to use the terrain to avoid and block those attacks until you can reach close enough to Big to cut through the platform underneath him and cause him to lose balance. Also, even though this game supports both controller and mouse and keyboard setups, drawing cuts with a laser is definitely faster with a mouse than with a controller's right stick. That's the whole loop of the game. It's really short, so I can't say it's a bad loop, but you deal with Big the exact same way every time. As a boss, he doesn't really test your proficiency with the tools, but more your reflexes when you see an object hurtling towards Tiny. It's not like you're embedding rockets onto slabs to propel them towards Big. There is one fight where you have to pull down 3 boxes with the claw, but that was really it. I think the game would have benefited if there was a little more automation in how certain objects would place themselves onto the environment after you cut them. It wouldn't be asking too much from the game, as it already does that in the later levels when you have to place blocks near locked doors to open them up. The blocks automatically place themselves into their slots once you're close enough to their ports. I don't dislike Tiny and Big. It's an interesting game that oozes style and tried to be unique with its platforming, and its story was charming enough to see through to the end. I always hoped Black Pants would make a sequel to iterate on the gameplay, but I think the rest of its catalog is 2D platformers and puzzle games. If you want to play a stylish looking platformer with quirky navigation tools, try out Tiny and Big. It's got a demo on Steam, and it's on sale right now for less than $2. I totally understand though, if you bounce off the game because of the combat set pieces.